Hello, and welcome to another edition of Ask the Professor. It's a crowd-supported feature. We depend upon your contributions to continue our work, and it's also crowd-supported in that we rely on you for the questions. We don't seed our own in. Every question we get is one that has been sent in by a viewer. And they're on everything: economics, political philosophy, culture, architecture. I like those ones. Just fishing a little here.
You're not allowed to fish.
All those things that concern us in our effort to build a good society together.
All right, and here's one that came from your YouTube channel from Ben, and he's asking, it's actually quite an interesting question. I'm curious what you have to say. What exactly makes a government illegitimate?
Well, that's an excellent question, because governments do lots of illegitimate things without becoming illegitimate. And in my view, the purpose of a government is to safeguard the legitimate rights of citizens. I hold very much a John Locke view of this, that when we enter into society and create governments, we do so to protect our natural right to life, to liberty, to property. That is, to ownership of ourselves and of the things we make honestly with our efforts. And so we delegate to government the powers that we bring into society. That is, the power to and the right to protect ourselves. But we cannot delegate to government any power we don't possess. Since I don't have the power in the state of nature, but I may have the physical power, but I don't have the moral right to take your stuff. So I can't get together with my fellows and vote that the government should take your stuff. And governments cannot take upon themselves powers like killing citizens when they were created for the express purpose of protecting citizens' lives. That doesn't apply, say, to capital punishment if you're duly convicted of murder. But essentially, the state exists to protect your natural rights. And so any government action is illegitimate that infringes rather than protecting a right. But when it comes to the question, is a government illegitimate because some of its actions are illegitimate, that is a very big jump. There certainly are illegitimate governments. I mean, I know Godwin's law, everything ends with Hitler, but the government of Nazi Germany sets the gold standard for complete illegitimacy. There is no moral obligation to obey any command that comes from that government, whether it is to be a concentration camp guard or a traffic regulation. The whole structure of that government's illegitimate. Likewise, Stalin's government, Robert Mugabe's government. If you obey the commands of that government out of prudence, you're under no obligation to do anything other than pretend to be a loyal follower of the regime. You can be working underground, you can be waiting for the moment to defect, any number of things like that, and you're in the right and they're in the wrong. So it's a question of whether the government in its habitual conduct infringes the rights of citizens in such a way that the laws are not legitimate, that the whole structure is wrong. And in a government that is legitimate, such as the Canadian government, which annoys me no end with its arrogance and its incompetence, but which is a legitimate government, you may sometimes decide that a law is so illegitimate that you're going to engage in nonviolent resistance to it.
Civil disobedience.
Yeah,
You're willing to go to jail over something that you really feel strongly about.
Yeah, because in a way, you're putting the state and your fellow citizens on the spot and saying, you have this bad law that I think is inconsistent with your values, with who you are. So I'm going to ask you, if I stand up and defy that law, are you really going to punish me? And it's remarkable to take a very unjust law, what Martin Luther King and millions of black and white Americans challenged that brought segregation to an end. These were illegitimate laws. They drew invidious, harmful distinctions on the basis of race. But Martin Luther King actually said the American government is legitimate. I am not going to join the underground and start blowing things up. He insisted on nonviolence. I'm going to challenge Americans to choose between the unjust law they have created and the justice that is at the heart of the system and is in their hearts. And so, like Gandhi challenging the British in India, he took a government that was doing illegitimate things and challenged it because it was legitimate by peaceful resistance and by defying the law openly and being willing to go to jail for it. So that's what you do in an extreme case. I mean, in a legitimate government, most of the time what you do is you work to change the law. You write newspaper columns, you write letters to the editor, you organize meetings, you galvanize people to work within the system for all its imperfections. But it really comes down to the question, is the state premised upon respecting the rights of the individual, and in some ways it's failing to do it, whether casually, just annoying little petty regulations, or something as bad as racial segregation in the United States, or is it a government that is fundamentally illegitimate? And I would say, by the way, thinking of the American example, that before the abolition of slavery, either a black or a white American could regard that government as illegitimate because I think it was absolutely morally right to resist slavery by subterfuge if that was safer or more effective, by open resistance if that could have been made to work. And in some sense, the Civil War is based upon a decision by a majority of the North that actually the government, insofar as it protected slavery, was illegitimate, and they made war on it, even though it had been their government until quite recently. But when you cross that line into a Nazi regime that is wantonly aggressive abroad, that carries out genocide at home, that jails and murders opponents of the regime, even if it's according to the letter of the law, there's a fundamental illegitimacy. So I think it has to come down to the question, is this regime premised upon respecting individual rights and sometimes fails to do it, or is it premised on trampling individual rights? The latter kind of government, the one that laughs in the face of John Locke's analysis, that's the government that I think is actually illegitimate. And as I say, prudence might require you to pretend to cooperate until you can take action to overthrow or escape it, but you're under no obligation to respect anything that it does. With a legitimate government, there is an obligation upon you to obey the law, even if you're defying the law and civil disobedience. You do it according to due process. You identify yourself, you say you did it, you go into court and say, yes, Your Honor, I am guilty. If you really think this is a good law, send me to jail. If not, strike down the law.
All right, let me add to Ben's question. In the U.S. system right now, the U.S. government is very legitimate. I mean, there's Congress, there's the Supreme Court. It's not just the presidency, right? The president is not that powerful, but is there a possibility that Donald Trump's administration, his own program, his own sliver of the U.S. government, could that cross into illegitimacy in your view?
Well, it can do so. I mean, for one thing, the executive branch can do things that, without rising to the level of undermining the legitimacy of the government, will be struck down by the courts because they are, in fact, not compatible with the Constitution, or perhaps the legislature will pass a new law that prevents the executive from doing something it was doing. But it's also possible, of course, for the executive to wander into lawlessness, as indeed can happen to the other branches. I mean, Richard Nixon would have been impeached and convicted if he hadn't resigned over Watergate, because the executive had, in fact, engaged in criminal acts. Bill Clinton was impeached. He was then acquitted, which I think was a mistake. But once the system works, Clinton remains legitimately the president, even if I think Congress made a mistake. So there are ways within the system to deal with lawlessness. It's when you get a situation, like in many Latin American republics, whose constitution was actually modeled on that of the United States, but worked completely differently in practice, where the president can do illegal things and Congress or the courts are either powerless to stop him or don't want to stop him. At that point, you have a government that is the same on paper, but is illegitimate in practice. But yeah, part of the mark of the rule of law is that if some part of the government goes rogue, an individual, a small office, even a large part of it, the other parts act to stop it according to the rule of law.
All right. So it's possible in theory, but you don't really see this as a possibility.
Oh, Trump could get impeached. I wouldn't. The way he behaves, I would not put it outside the bounds of possibility. But if he does, it'll be proof that the American government is legitimate, as the Watergate crisis actually was. It's amazing. It restored Americans' faith in government. The president was driven for office for being lawless and foul-mouthed.
And this could happen again.
The system did work.
Exactly. All right. All right, then. I think I got it. Thanks for that, folks. If you would like to play along and ask your question of the professor, go to the URL on your screen, and everything there will be explained. Thanks, and see you next time.